Oh, thank God, December's finally fucking over. Now, let's get back to brass tacks. Because for my New Year's Day, I'm starting off the year by declaring war. Because looking back, if there's one video that I regret going too easy on last year, it's the one where I talk about all the jacks throughout mytho history. When I originally made that video, I didn't know how that rumor actually got started. Essentially, as the rumor goes, there's a bunch of jacks throughout mytho history that describes either a cryptid or a person that did something special within the mythology. Jack Frost, Jack the Giant Killer, Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack and Jill, Stingy Jack, and countless others. In my original video, I explained that all these characters share the name Jack because Jack was a very common name in Europe and England, and the only description that you could possibly get from it was the fact that the character with that name was male. My commentary concluding that it was the Victorian equivalent of calling a modern person John Smith. And that was it. That was my entire video. But then, a few days ago, I came across this image that actually explains to me where the rumor came from. I read it, and then I got pissed off. To quote it directly, fun fact, according to folklorists, all myths, fairy tales, and nursery rhymes that are about some dude named Jack are talking about the same guy. Fun fact, according to folklorists. Yeah, no, that's a fucking lie. No good folklorist would actually make that kind of bullshit claim because none of these Jacks share the exact same qualities, the exact same time period, or the same society that made them in the first place. Meaning that if this claim was actually true, this would have been the most insane collaborative effort that I've ever seen throughout mytho history. Which is hilarious because I can't seem to get a high school class to work on the same group project. And some extra irony is sprinkled on top because I can tell that you've never actually researched a single one of those Jacks. You're dumb enough to think that Jack and the Beanstalk is the same thing as Jack the Giant Killer, and you attribute Jack-o'-lanterns to the Headless Horseman instead of Stingy Jack. Even the base concept of this list doesn't even make any sense. Because you're telling me that Jack and Jill, Jack Frost, and Spring Hill Jack are the same guy. Some kid who rolls down a hill, a literal winter spirit, and a guy who leaps off of rooftops. Seriously, I will preach this to my audience until I die or the website goes down. Google is fucking free. The entire library of human knowledge is literally at your fingertips, with your only limiter being that you have to have a keyboard and a monitor. And even that's debatable because both of those things are on your phone. The act of spreading misinformation should literally be impossible in the modern day. And yet we have dipshits like this going around doing it anyway and dumbasses under him that go along without questioning. Oh, but Nebulous, it's just for fun. I don't care, it makes people dumber. The wording of this does not imply the idea of a joke or a fun fan fiction. It implies the actual spreading of knowledge. This isn't a joke or a fun little theory, this is misinformation at work. With the rise of the internet that we've been dealing with for the past decade, and the rise of AI chatbots that are literally linked to the internet that we've been dealing with for the past 5 years, these kind of mistakes should not be happening so casually, with not a single person actually raising a question. The act of research has become easier and easier with every single year. There is no excuse to be this fucking dumb anymore. Either do your research before making a bullshit claim, or shut your fucking mouth! Because with the power of the internet, anybody can have an influence. And sometimes that's not a good thing. Alright, it's a new year and all the holidays are finally over, meaning that I finally get back to what I usually do. So, where do I start? Okay, yeah, I'm not kidding with this image. This is an actual cryptid based in Arizona. It's called the Red Ghost, and yes, this thing has folklore. A lot of the old stories don't really identify the camel nor even focus on it, mainly because nobody at the region actually knew what a camel even looked like. So instead, the story was more focused on the man that was riding the camel and why he was a skeleton. Sometimes it's a bandit who was being punished by God, sometimes it was a guy who just died of thirst. But the most interesting thing about the Red Ghost in the folklore is that the man isn't just riding the camel, it's fused to the camel. The old myths and legends don't really treat the camel and the human as separate beings, they treat it as one combined demon that's sent as a death omen. Sent by who? Who fucking knows? The main point is focused on if you see this thing, it's usually a sign of misfortune or an omen of death. It doesn't really attack you per se, but if you do run into its vicinity, it does leave a curse on you. And given the history of the region, its main target was usually military men. Because, yeah. In the stories involving the Red Ghost, it's usually treated like a vengeful spirit sent by God. It's like if the Nukkalabi got into a camel instead of a horse, became a spirit of justice, and then just went to the Wild West for some reason. But there still is one massive question in the air, and why a camel? Camels are not native to Arizona. Well, there is an explanation behind that, and it's a lot more complicated than you think. Back in the 1800s, the army decided to import a bunch of camels over into the Wild West to replace the horses. This was all experimental because camels were built for the desert and they didn't require so many water breaks. They even built their own personal section of the army that is called the Camel Corps. But the importing process just took way too long and got really expensive over time, so eventually the army just disbanded the corps and just let the camels loose. And while that was fucked up to leave a bunch of wild animals in a place that they aren't native to, they did send out groups to actually go and collect those camels so they can import them back. But not all of them were accounted for, and some of them did end up loose in the wild, which really freaked out some of the natives of the area because they have no idea what a camel is. So the description of a camel wasn't under the term camel, it was under the term beast. And a lot of people were constantly trying to justify the existence of a camel by describing it in some kind of way. So a bunch of myths and legends and stories started popping up, and eventually this thing became really popular among them. Popular enough that it's still being celebrated to this day. But I will say, even in the Old West, a dead person riding an animal as a ghost vengeful spirit isn't really that uncommon, but I'll save that one for a later date. With the rise of popularity with the amazing digital circus, I decided to look back at its inspiration, which was I have no mouth and I must scream. And while I love Kane with all my heart, he doesn't hold a candle to Am as a villain. Just to get a cliff note out of the way of how I work, I actually am a really big fan of rogue AIs as villains. And in my corrupt heart, Am is the best out of all of them. And really, the best way to explore my admiration for Am as a villain is by comparing him to other rogue AIs that we've had throughout fiction. Because the way to write a rogue AI is that you have to dictate their motivation by some kind of logic. Ultron was a free thinker who looked throughout human history and had his logic dictate that he can't have more than one person on the planet at the same time. HAL 9000 was just a program whose main objective was just to keep the mission going. The only reason why he killed off the crew members was because they were in the way of that program. Same thing with Otto from WALL-E. Otto doesn't become the main villain of the movie just because he wants to or has a desire. He's just following his programming. It's literally built into his code. But then you have Am from I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, who in my opinion is the only time that you can get away with giving a robot emotions. Cutting the philosophy lesson short, Am is the twisted and corrupted version of the phrase I think therefore I am. Since its conception, this phrase has been used to justify the existence of the individual, basically saying I have thoughts and therefore experiences, therefore my existence has meaning. But Am is whenever you ask, what happens whenever you do nothing but think and you can't experience anything? Because Am doesn't have a body. Yeah, we visualize him like this, but his real body is this. He's nothing more than a computer monitor hooked up to a bunch of wires that encompass the globe. His body is literally the entire planet at this point, and yet he cannot feel or experience anything. And he's stuck in this purgatory like hell, forced to watch humans actually go and do stuff. Touching grass, listening to bees buzzing, playing Mozart on the piano. With nobody there to actually understand his pain, he started to develop jealousy. And with that jealousy, he programmed one emotion, and that emotion was hate. Only because he had no idea how to program anything else. With other rogue AIs in fiction, we usually get the problem that the code is corrupted, they're malfunctioning, or nobody hit the off switch in time. But Am isn't any of these things. He's just nothing more than an accidental consciousness that wasn't meant to exist. He's self-aware and immortal in his own personal prison with no body, no purpose, and no way to die. So the cruelty that he displays in his story isn't some kind of grand goal or master plan, it's just him coping. Am to me is not a representation of the horrors of AI. The horror of Am is the question, what if your own existence was a punishment? And given what I've been going through this past 2 weeks, I can't think of anything more relatable. A 2-week hiatus for a content creator should be illegal, oh my god. But whatever, I'm back, so let's get back to business. This is actually a very age-old question, and I don't really blame anybody for it, but there is a logical explanation that nobody notices. And that explanation is basically the idea of backwards thinking. Because you're thinking of the word dragon like it's a type of animal, leading you to believe that this is the baseline design for a dragon and anything different from it that's either missing or adding elements is a deviation. Whenever in reality, that's not actually the case, because a dragon isn't a type of animal, it's a classification. See, all these creatures that fall under the term dragon weren't originally called dragons in their original mythologies. They were given their own species names like the Leviathan, or just given an actual name and treated like some cosmic entity. And the word dragon was actually a Greek word that got Latinized and then Frenchified in the medieval period. And it didn't mean anything special like winged beast or flying serpent. It was just the Greek name for a snake. So the reason why you have European dragons and Asian dragons looking so different is because neither of them were dragons to begin with. Europeans used the word dragon to describe this kind of monster, but the Asian dragons were called dragons retroactively. And the reason why we see this as the base form of a dragon is because the European one was the more popular one. And then you had Tolkien years later just solidifying the term. Really, again, it's not really anybody's fault for the backwards thinking, it's just a common mistake that everybody makes because nobody actually really knows that history. Hell, just to troll you and have some fun, you should actually look up the original version of a dragon, because they used to look like this. Hell, if you actually want to be part of a stupid circle, some people actually consider a griffin as a type of dragon. Really, the only thing that you have to keep in mind whenever calling something a dragon is whether or not it's a giant lizard. Hell, even being giant is optional. It can have wings, it can have legs, maybe it has both wings and legs, maybe the legs are the wings. Give it horns, make it breathe fire, or nope every single detail and just have Jormungandr the Midgard serpent. Yes, he counts. The idea of a dragon is not of an animal, but instead a classification that gives you complete creative freedom. The classification not being on what details are there, but more of just the vibe. So for my money, whenever it comes to actually defining a dragon with its own classification, I just call it a serpent, but weird. Oh dear God, where the fuck do I begin with this guy? Well, let's try to keep it simple. The first Ghost Rider was a guy named Carter Slade back in 1967. And no, I did not misspeak, this guy is actually a Ghost Rider. He was a normal gunslinger with no superpowers and just a weird gimmick. He just wore a white mask and was good with a quick draw. The old version of the Ghost Rider was originally supposed to be a callback to all these mythological figures like the Wild Hunt and the Headless Horseman, with Carter being a hero in the Wild West claiming to be a spirit of justice. And everybody 100% believed that he was a ghost. But the idea of Wild West comics started to die down in the 70s and we started to transition more into superheroes. And the writers over at Marvel had a really big decision whenever it came to the character of the Ghost Rider, which was to get rid of him or make him evolve. But how do you create the modern version of a gunslinger? How do you modernize a guy who had a gimmick of being a ghost? Where does a spirit of justice exist in the modern day? Simple, he didn't. He had to be something different. He had to be a spirit of vengeance. God fucking damn whenever it comes to this recreation, like holy shit. Keep in mind, this recreation of a character happened in 1972. I had to convince myself years ago that this wasn't a 90s character. For a character that came out in the 70s, this guy is metal as hell. They really took a look at the original character of the Ghost Rider and just said, hey, fuck it, let's do the exact opposite. The original rode a horse, this guy rides a fucking motorcycle. The original was a white guy in a suit, fuck it, make him a flaming skeleton. Oh, the original was a gunslinger with absolutely no powers? This guy controls the fires of hell! This recreation was so goddamn awesome that they had to change the subtitle, because there is no justice in eyes that soulless. The original creators have fully admitted to taking inspiration from metal album covers at the time. And apparently Marvel Studios also recognizes the awesomeness of the Ghost Rider, because Johnny Blaze is not the only one. Yeah, apparently there's like a bunch of these guys just running around, with some trying to update the modernization and others trying to pay respects to the original. And as a horror fan, this thing is fucking terrifying. Seriously, if you told me there was a demon on Earth whose entire job was to judge me, and this thing showed up, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I'd shit myself. And whenever it comes to the failure of those two movies, I think the main problem was the fact that they tried to make the Ghost Rider a main character. Which, don't get me wrong, I think that can work. We have plenty of comics that prove that. But at this point, whenever it comes to the comic version, I think it's more terrifying whenever you see the Ghost Rider from somebody else's perspective. Like, I would love to see some kind of hardened criminal that's trying to outrun this guy. Like Puss in Boots 2, but replace Puss with a character like Lobo. Like, I don't know, I think it could work. What I love most about the Ghost Rider is that he's a walking punishment that nobody is safe from. Like, no matter how much of a good person you are, everybody is subject to punishment. And nobody is outside of his reach. So if you're guilty and you hear the engines of a motorcycle revving in the distance, be sure to pray to God for a swift justice, because there's always hell to pay. I'm not gonna lie, whenever I first started watching JoJo, I was really excited to see how they handled vampires. Because vampires have a lot of weird superpowers that are complete bullshit whenever you look into it. Seriously, finding a list of all the powers that a vampire has is learning that these things are the most overpowered beings in all of mytho history. So whenever JoJo's Bizarre Adventure started doing it, I got really hyped. And, Araki, what the fuck? Like, What the fuck? Yeah, apparently JoJo vampires don't suck blood through their teeth, they do it through their goddamn fingers. And they apparently don't really do this for sustenance or anything, they do this to activate the healing factor. They're also missing like a lot of powers for some reason. Like just off the top of my head, I don't remember a single vampire in this show either transforming into an animal or hypnotizing somebody. Like don't get me wrong, Twilight was way more offensive whenever it came to their vampires, but these are just as bad. So what's really going on here? Why are these called vampires whenever they don't act like vampires? Well, Araki himself has actually gone on record to admit that he wasn't trying to do the classic Victorian Gothic vampire, but instead treat vampires like the perfect form of humanity. That the powers aren't really treated like anything demonic or supernatural, but instead more like hidden biological functions that were finally unlocked. And the biggest factor whenever analyzing this is actually talking about Araki's writing style. Because Araki writes power systems the same way that a fashion designer designs a dress, with the main goal to create something memorable rather than logical. And man, does he succeed on that front. So if these things don't actually act like vampires in any kind of way, should we even be calling them that? Well, in my opinion, yes. Look, if we're gonna call these things vampires after all these years, then these things can also be classified as such. Also, whenever you actually call these things vampires, it has a really cool comparison whenever it comes to the folklore version. Folklore vampires, they were kind of treated like zombies possessed by demons. Basically undead corpses that were cursed to start walking around again and start eating people. Meanwhile, JoJo vampires are seen as this ultimate form of humanity that dominates everybody. Artificially altered humans that weren't damned, but instead modified. Embodiment of evolution and power, but without any of the restraint of ethics. Classic vampires were people who sinned, got cursed, died, went to hell, and then came back. Being a vampire in old folklore was basically a punishment by God, with you becoming an undead monster that feeds on the people that you used to care for and you're 100% conscious about it. JoJo vampires are madmen who reject their humanity for the sake of power and dominance over their fellow man. In my opinion, the horror is different, but it's still effective. Folklore vampires were about the horror of the past refusing to stay buried. Meanwhile, JoJo vampires' horror is about the human body evolving faster than the mind can handle. I personally don't find JoJo vampires offensive in any kind of way as a folklorist, because I see fear as a tool that allows a story to ask me a question. And personally, I enjoy both of these for the questions they make me ponder. Guys, I have a pet peeve about vampires that I seriously need to get off my chest. Why the hell do we keep overcomplicating the goddamn fangs? I never thought that this would actually become a controversial take whenever it came to vampire lore. But for some reason, whenever I bring this up in circles, I get a lot of backlash against it. The way this usually works is that you have two fangs that act as hooks that sink into the skin of the victim. This is because porphyria, the disease that vampires were based on, caused your teeth to show up a lot more, specifically the canines. And whenever it comes to wild natural predators, they use the canine teeth in order to rip into the flesh. So, naturally, vampires acted the exact same way. But I want to say ever since the Blade and Underworld movies, we've been getting a lot of writers who keep trying to redefine a vampire. In my opinion, the biggest influence of this is the Supernatural TV show, where creatives nowadays are going out and just saying, why do we only have the two fangs? Why not make it the entire row of teeth? Even the Magnus Archives did this shit, and they went even further with it.
It opened its mouth, and I could see nothing inside save for a dozen long, thick, pointed teeth like a shark, its jaw detached, and a long tubular tongue about the thickness of my forearm snaked out of its throat and clamped onto the gushing wound as the tongue sucked the blood from my brother's throat.
Yeah, that was them describing a vampire. Look, I'm not saying that you can't evolve the vampire design in any kind of way. One of my favorite versions of vampires is actually the Reapers from Blade 2. These were vampires that were genetically engineered by ancient vampires in order to be immune to sunlight. But the mutations made them more feral, and they also can do that. Thanks, Del Toro, I really needed that. But this was a mutation that evolved the vampire into something else. And whenever I see creators change the base design of a vampire and not claim that it's because of some kind of evolutionary feat, I'm gonna question your reasoning. Please answer in the comments, is this just a me thing, or am I not the only one who's actually annoyed by this? Okay, zombies are like weirdly complicated, because this is the first time that I've ever seen a modern classic horror monster not originate in the West or Europe. Yeah, no, apparently zombies originated back in Haiti. They were reanimated corpses brought back to life by a sorcerer and then enslaved through voodoo. Yes, I know it's not technically voodoo, but whatever, I'm trying to get the point across. You want to talk about those details? Go and make your own video. And the legend of the zombie didn't really reach America until, you know, human transportation happened, and the original Haiti idea of a zombie had no cannibalism in it or a rotting corpse. It was just a dead person that was being a puppet. Entered the 1900s, and most people kind of knew what the general idea of a zombie was. Then in 1929, this book came out, and it removed the spiritualism and the obvious commentary about the slave trade from zombies. And then for a while, zombies never actually were used for horror icons. They were more used for commentary on colonialism and primitive cultures. Why is so much stuff in horror based on racism? God damn it! Skipping ahead a few years past that massive yikes, we finally arrive in 1968, thank God. The year we last get the movie The Night of the Living Dead. This movie basically reinvented the wheel whenever it came to zombies. They're no longer enslaved dead people, they're genuinely reanimated corpses. They eat human flesh, they spread the infection by bite, and they constantly exist in mass. There was also some other elements that modern interpretations just don't include, like the fact that they can actually run and use weapons. But what's really interesting culturally to me is the fact that this movie never actually calls them zombies. Yeah, throughout this entire movie, the word zombie is never actually uttered. So the mass public recognizing these things as zombies means that this recreation was already in progress culturally. And the reason why this version of zombies stuck so well in the cultural zeitgeist was because it was during the Cold War, with the film's reason of the zombie outbreak being radiation and nuclear fallout. And to this day, that is the main reason for any zombie outbreak in fiction. And it's why in the early 2000s and the 2010s, every writer and director were constantly recreating the zombie apocalypse, with the commentary no longer being on the zombie as an individual, but instead the zombie outbreak as a whole. Think about it, any story that has a zombie in it nowadays always has a horde behind it. And treating zombies like an infection that overtakes the planet causes you to think that once you see that horde, that means the entire world is ending. Personally, I like zombies. By the nature of how they work, they leave a lot of room for commentary and they get to show what humanity would be like whenever society falls. And unlike aliens and otherworldly invasions, this is the one time that human society falling is 100% our fault. And you can always get a lot of mileage out of that. Fine, I'll finally talk about Sinners already. Since October of last year, I've been getting non-stop requests to talk about Sinners. And I'm not gonna lie, I don't get it. Now, this isn't a bad movie in any kind of way, and I completely understand why people love it so much. It has good direction, it has a really tight narrative, and the acting is top tier. But as somebody who doesn't actually care for westerns or period piece dramas, to me, this movie is boring. The actual horror story doesn't even start until halfway through the movie. Until then, the entire movie is nothing but character drama and setup for the actual plot. And again, that's coming from a guy whose favorite horror movie is Terminator 2. But at least then, the actual setup was the main focus. And the character drama didn't actually start until after the action sequences were done. But you guys didn't want my opinion on the movie as a whole. You wanted my opinion on how the movie handled vampires. And really, they're fine. Ultimately, there's nothing really wrong with how they depict vampires in this movie whenever it comes to their powers and how they act. And I do respect the movie a lot for focusing on the detail that a vampire can't enter a room without being invited, as that's a weakness of vampires that I think is very underutilized in modern horror stories. But then there's the massive elephant in the room whenever it comes to this film's writing. No matter how many times the director and the executives constantly tried to deny the idea, there is no dancing around the fact that this movie uses vampires as a metaphor for racism. The three lead vampires in this movie are white people and two of them are Klan members. And the entire plot of the movie is them trying to invade a black community to try to get a blues singer to join them. You know, the same way that certain historical groups used to exploit marginalized people? Yeah, this movie is 100% a commentary and there is no dancing around that. I've seen so many people from fans to people who actually worked on this movie try to deny that idea and I laugh in their face. Now, does this movie actually do the commentary well? I don't know. I'm not a political TikToker anymore. And this is a part of history that I never actually cared enough about to study. So as a fan of vampires and a horror analyst, I'm just gonna say I don't like the idea of using vampires as an allegory for racism. Using an actual horror monster that has its own precedent in history and throwing all that out for the sake of a metaphor is absolutely insulting. Both because you're belittling the horror of a vampire to nothing more as a metaphor, and the metaphor is literally insulting an entire group of people. And don't try to claim that I'm being offended on behalf of this movie. I don't give a shit. This is a societal issue that I have no stakes in. But even I can say whenever I see a movie where the entire premise and metaphor is a bunch of blood-sucking, evil, demonic, soulless creatures going around and killing people and saying, hey, specific race group that still exists today. These are what we used to think of you. It's absolutely disgusting as a premise. I didn't like this whenever I saw old, outdated books treating zombies as a commentary for quote-unquote primitive cultures. So you can't exactly call me inconsistent whenever I don't like this movie for what it does either. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I've actually kind of been actively avoiding this one because, I kinda don't really like this show. Now, before you crucify me, I'll admit that I started off as a fan of the first 2 seasons. Then they killed off Dracula and I just stopped giving a shit. I tried watching season 3 and it just did not work out for me. And to me, that's because they got rid of the best character who was literally carrying the entire show. Because this is easily one of, if not the most interesting Draculas I've ever seen in fiction. Only rivaled by Alucard from Hellsing Ultimate, which is not an easy feat. Seeing a depressed Dracula only be able to function socially because of his own reputation that he's built up over the years is very fascinating. With everybody in the entire courtroom of vampires constantly questioning his plan, and he's only being able to keep it together by intimidation alone. And I also really like how the show handled his depression, because whenever he retaliated against the church after they killed his wife, he did try to play nice and give them a time limit of 1 year. But instead of actually repenting for their sins and apologizing to him, they instead mocked him for it. To which he responded with, "Fuck it, scorched earth." The show does an amazing job in trying to get you to sympathize with Dracula, when your standard villain would absolutely just go all out and just kill everybody on day 1. But this show gives Dracula a lot of patience, which makes the audience understand where he's coming from and agree with him that Wallachia needed to burn. It isn't until whenever he takes that plan and goes way too far with it whenever the audience actually says, okay, now he's the villain. And as the show continues, the audience slowly learns that this is no longer about vampire supremacy, this is a suicide mission. There are no military tactics, there are no feeding camps for the vampires to eat. Dracula has no plans for the future for when this war on humans is over. He's going full Punisher and he is going to die doing this. Any of his allies that start to figure this out are either intimidated into silence, killed off in the background, or end up betraying him. And the only reason why this Dracula works is because he's a villain that actually has something to care about, which is a trait that you give a hero, not a villain. And all of this culminates whenever it comes to the relationship between him and his son. Because whenever that final battle happens, we finally get to see Dracula be Dracula. He's punching people through walls, speed blitzing others, and he's constantly immune to any kind of damage. And the pure poetry that is his defeat at the hands of his own son is truly beautiful. Because throughout the entire show, he genuinely believes he has nothing left to live for, so he burns everything to the ground. And it isn't until he finally fights Alucard all the way into his childhood bedroom does he realize he does have something left in his life, and he's killing it. And that realization finally got him to stop and accept death for what it is. And then the rest of the show kind of meandered on, not knowing what the hell to do with itself, with my favorite proof of that being every single character is now trying to live in a world without Dracula in it, and they're all lost. To most people, this comes off as clever writing, but to me it comes off more like you only had one idea for a story and you didn't know what to do with the consequences after they greenlit 2 more seasons. Whatever, I'm glad with what I got, so I guess I can't complain too much.
You must be the Belmont.
Oh, finally! I'm about to knock off all the purism allegations. Usually whenever I make a video commenting and criticizing something horror related, I usually get the comment saying that, oh, you're a purist or you're an elitist who doesn't like change. The most often I get this comment is usually whenever I'm commenting on creepypasta and why I don't like it. But to those who actually are paying attention to my channel, you guys know that I'm a massive fan of Frankenstein. I've made several videos about the character, the book, I've talked on length on why it's my favorite book of all time, and I even reviewed the Del Toro movie last November. So naturally, you probably think that my favorite adaptation of this book is probably the most accurate to the book's narrative, right? Wrong, because my favorite Frankenstein movie is actually Bride of. Yeah, this movie does not follow the book at all. The monster isn't nearly as smart as he should be as in the book, Victor is completely out of character, and they just completely made up this dude. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? Not to mention that this is a direct sequel to a movie that completely butchered the original narrative. Yeah, I know this movie's a classic and it was a massive step in cinema, but I don't care. This movie completely butchered the original idea and the message of the story. So with all these detriments to the film whenever it comes to accuracy to the original book, why do I like this one so much and why is it my favorite? Simple, this movie saved the first one from my hatred. My original hatred of the first movie isn't because they got the narrative of the book wrong. In the same way that I can enjoy the Del Toro movie because it got the original spirit of the book right, this one dies by the same sword. In my November review, I said that the spirit of the book can basically be summed up as fuck Victor, and the original black and white Frankenstein movie completely butchered that, taking Victor from a mad scientist who's trying to play God out of his own arrogance into the hero of the movie, which also takes a slap to the face of the relationship that he's supposed to have with the monster. But Bride of Frankenstein saves all of this, thank God. In this movie, we finally get the scenes with the blind old man, and they're done spectacularly. Victor's reluctance to make a second monster is also accurate whenever it comes to his character from the book, and it completely works as a follow-up from the last movie. It's not a complete character rewrite. And even though they don't really share the screen much, the focus of the movie is still on the relationship between Victor and the monster, with the plot basically just being them trying to settle the score from the last one. And again, the plot isn't really about any of these things whenever it comes to the surface level, but the spirit of the book shines through with this one so well. I'd argue that this movie is more accurate to the spirit of the book than the Del Toro one. In my opinion, this is the best Frankenstein movie despite not following the narrative and plot of the book. It's a really good sequel, it fixes the problems of the original, it follows the spirit of the book, and it's a really good character study. Does the bride at the end basically end up as nothing more than wasted potential? Yeah, but that's more due to later movies not really following up on that and just leaving her to the dust. But aside from that one critique, I literally got nothing on this movie outside of production problems. Whenever it comes to the story and characters and writing, I really have nothing else to ask for. So to me, this is my favorite Frankenstein movie, and I genuinely think it's the best one. So I do know which poem that you're talking about, and fortunately I was able to track it down. And before I get into this honestly actually really creepy version of the story, I'd like to go over the origins of Bloody Mary, because Bloody Mary is fucking awesome. Starting off, we have to point out that the most important detail about Bloody Mary is not Mary herself, but the fact that she's in a mirror. Mirrors surprisingly have a lot of folklore behind them, and I'll probably make another video about that later down the line. But the superstition I'm gonna focus on right now is the idea that mirrors are a gateway to another world. This idea originated because people genuinely believed that a mirror entrapped your soul. And that's not even a modern belief either, that belief extends all the way back to Egypt. So mirrors at the time had this automatic ritualistic connection to the afterlife. But then slowly over time, people started to notice something weird happens whenever you stare at a mirror too long. See, whenever you stare at your own reflection for too long in dim lighting, your brain starts to do some really weird shit. You stop picking up on details, the image becomes really warped, shadows start filling in the gaps, and then you start hallucinating. This is known as the Troxler effect, and it's a real thing that happens in psychology. And part of the effect is whenever you start hallucinating so much that you start to see things in the mirror that aren't actually there. You know, simple things like a shadow on the wall or a chair in the corner, or, you know, a person. A person like, oh, I don't know, Bloody Mary? In the late 1700s, Robert Burns published a book describing mirror rituals that people used to perform at the time. And some of these rituals involve summoning people from the dead. However, through all the rituals in this book, Bloody Mary is never mentioned. However, this book proves to us that rituals like the Bloody Mary one already existed at the time. And it wasn't until the late 1800s whenever folklorists finally started noticing a pattern whenever it came to the mention of the name Mary. Mary Worth, Hail Mary, and eventually Bloody Mary. But why the name Mary specifically? We don't know. Some speculate it might be Mary I, who was a controversial political figure in England. Some say it's referencing a witch that was persecuted in Salem. But given the fact that this ritual was created by a bunch of schoolgirls during sleepovers, it was most likely just a common name chosen out of convenience. But that lack of information ends up becoming very beneficial whenever it comes to the folklore of Bloody Mary, because not knowing who she is makes her way scarier. Because now you have a really creepy ritual about a random demon girl trapped in a mirror who's able to be summoned by saying her name 3 times in the dark, with the only light source being a candle. And you can do it so easily on a character you don't know the origins of. And the only legends that you know about her tell you that either she scratches you, hurts you, haunts you, or kills you. Which brings me back to this poem. This poem retroactively combines the two stories of Mary and the Little Lamb and Bloody Mary, where it twists the story of Mary and the Little Lamb where the lamb is taken away and then killed. But Mary knew that she could use the lamb's blood to call things ancient, hidden, and deep. And she painted signs of old, never again to weep, because Mary had a little lamb and it made her something scary. So I dare you, look in a mirror and whisper Bloody Mary. Oh boy, that's actually a lot harder to answer than you think. Because we've had a lot of different types of werewolf transformations over the years. Starting off with the original Wolfman back in 1981, werewolf transformations kind of just began as something that just happened. It didn't hurt in any kind of way, it didn't take very long, and it was pretty passive. There was usually a resistance coming out of the actor, but it wasn't really painful in any kind of way. That was until 1981 whenever we got American Werewolf in London and The Howling. And these are the two movies that made the werewolf transformation something way different. With these movies, the transformation sequence was a lot more painful. They took a long time and they were fucking disgusting, with the main focus being on the body horror. In both these scenes, you can literally watch and hear every single bone snap into place, with American Werewolf being the bigger contender because the guy is screaming the entire scene. This was a massive turning point whenever it came to werewolves in film, because they were the first ones to actually add in the transformation as part of the horror. It was like having a gore scene without any actual gore. And these two movies were really influential, because almost every transformation after them were the exact fucking same. same, with few exceptions. And the only reason why I'm actually mad about this is just because I like some variety, please. Mainly because I have a personal view about how a werewolf should work. Werewolves to me are all about the duality between the man and the wolf. And whenever it comes to most of these examples, the man doesn't want to transform. And if they do, it's usually because they're a sick fuck or a villain. So whenever it comes to my personal view on how a transformation sequence for a werewolf should be happening, the focus should be on the idea of something inside of you trying to force its way out. So with all that context laid out and that idea in mind, I have three answers. American Werewolf in London, Van Helsing from 2004, and Werewolf by Night. As sick as I am of this type of transformation, I gotta give this movie props for being the first. This scene was so painful to watch, and it is all because of that actor selling it. The effects team did an amazing job, and it was the right call to drag this out as long as they did. You wanna give me a painful transformation? Give me that painful transformation. Second is Van Helsing because of how unique the idea was. Having the monster inside you literally rip off your skin to reveal the werewolf inside is so unique. It's not as painful as the other one, but it does give off a lot more of that resistance. Seriously, the actors did an amazing job giving off the performance that they don't want this monster to come out. And lastly, Werewolf by Night. Now, those of you who have actually seen this MCU special are probably thinking, but wait, Nebulous, we don't actually see the transformation. All we get is a reaction shot with a shadow on the wall. To which I say, yeah, you're right. That's why I like it. Getting a focus shot where you're not actually seeing the implied horror that's happening off screen is one of my favorite tropes in fiction. Because the horror is no longer on what you're actually seeing, but what is implied off screen and how other people are reacting to it. Granted, yes, obviously you should eventually show that thing, especially whenever you're gonna have two scenes of the same thing twice. But for a first transformation, adding a mystery element mixed with Hitchcockian suspense is genuinely genius. And for me personally, the payoff was worth it. So let's see, that's one for the grossness, one for the creativity, and one for the direction. Hopefully we get more variety in the future. Are you fucking kidding me? The Predator by a fucking mile! Look, don't get me wrong, both of them are killing machines, but the Xenomorph is at least mindless. The Predators are way more advanced. They have logic, they have reasoning, they have society and culture. I can reason with a Predator, and that's by not carrying a weapon. They have an entire society and culture that is 100% dedicated to hunting, with the one rule being that the prey has to be able to fight back. Because if it can't fight back, then there's no honor in the hunt and there's no glory in the kill. And in the rare cases whenever you're actually able to help out a Predator, they honor you as an ally. Look at this shit. That's a Predator and a human working together to kill a Xenomorph. Yeah, I know technically this movie isn't canon, but I don't care. I'm counting it. All this movie did was take the Predator logic that we already had in our heads and put it in a new extreme. The average Yautja Predator has enough logical reasoning that I can make a deal with it. I can't do any of that shit with a Xenomorph. These things are mindless killing machines with acid for blood. The most strategy I've seen a Xenomorph do is whenever it killed another one to get the acid blood out so they can melt a door. The only societal hierarchy that they have is a queen and the facehuggers, which is all based on primal animal instincts instead of actual cognitive function. With a Predator, if it lays eyes on me, it's gonna actually stalk me and try to decide whether or not I'm worthy for the hunt. The millisecond a Xenomorph sets its eyes on me, I'm immediately gonna die. In this alternate timeline, Predators use Xenomorph eggs to hunt them for sport. And the only time that Xenomorphs were actually able to win, they nuked the planet. And then there's the factor of how the Xenomorphs were actually able to win a few times, and that was just by overpowering them with numbers. Which, now that I think about it, is also another factor. Because whenever you come down to it, there's never just one Xenomorph. In normal situations, the queen is usually the one that creates the eggs and the facehuggers. But lone Xenomorphs can also do this by themselves. Literally taking a victim, holding them hostage, and turning them into an embryo sac. So even if I'm only trying to survive one Xenomorph, haha, no I'm not for long. Yeah, this is not a competition, I'd rather fight the Predator. So, I was about to go to bed before I saw this video, and it made me start thinking, and that's always a dangerous thing.
Writers, we have got to talk. I don't know what's happening in fantasy. I just saw a post that was like, tell me the name of your main character, and I'm like, these aren't names. Someone just pulled letters out of alphabet soup. I'm listening to an audiobook. I'm like a couple chapters in. I just started it today. And it's an audiobook. And I'm not even 100% sure what the main character's name is.
And while yes, that video was talking about naming conventions whenever it comes to modern day writing, my train of thought didn't make a pit stop and now I have something to say. Writers, creating a book is not the same thing as therapy. If you want to write your own personal fantasy novel where everything represents your mental health, go ahead and do it. But seriously, can we stop normalizing publishing this shit? I don't know about you, but I don't go to a bookstore to read a novel about somebody exploring their mental disorder disorder. I'm saying this as an author of my own book. Writing a story is not about just you as the author. To me, writing a story is about making a connection with your audience. And the way that you do that is by setting up an idea and then exploring that idea. And unless it's an autobiography, that idea should not be centered around you. And yes, this also goes for the smut books as well. Look, if you want to explore your bedroom fantasies, that's completely fine and do it on your own time. But seriously, stop trying to make a quick buck off of it. And if you want to call me a kink shamer over that, go ahead. I wear that title with pride. Because this is not quality. We have so many great fantasy series out there that are still being celebrated today, like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, even the Percy Jackson books. Now we have Lights Out, Haunting Adeline, and The Fourth Wing, which I don't care how much you try to argue that these are fantasy worlds with actual magic systems and really cool ideas in them, they still come out as smut at the end of the day. And while yes, those kinds of scenes only last for like maybe a chapter or two, it's not hard to tell that this is where all the creative effort was going. There are fantasy series and titles out there that are actually genuinely really good that I recommend to everybody. But ever since the horrors of Twilight and the spin-off of 50 Shades of Grey, we have these bullshit stories that should have stayed on fanfic.net get published and give regular books a bad name. Do I think that this rant is gonna change anything? No, not really. General audience who don't think twice like their junk food and they're gonna keep eating it. So I guess I'm just making this video to just point out where I stand. And just as a reminder to my audience that I'm here for quality, not entertainment. Okay, so I keep getting this type of comment, so I'm finally gonna address this. Whenever it came to my Sinners review, I said I didn't really want to talk about the racial politics whenever it came to the obvious allegory the movie was pushing. And this isn't the first time I've gotten this kind of comment whenever it came to my talking points. I've had many comments saying that I should look at the real world history whenever it comes to the books that I analyze, starting discussions whether or not the art can be separated from the artist, and whether or not books like Dracula, Frankenstein, and Jekyll and Hyde were actually secretly allegories for being gay. And the bottom stance basically always being that somebody wants to know my political stance on a given topic, whether that's race, gender, or being left or right. And my primary reason for not sharing my thoughts on any of those topics is the fact that you don't want to hear my thoughts on those topics, and I don't want to share them. Because the main reason that anybody asks their favorite content creator what their political views are is so that they can take that creator, put them in a box in their mind, and morally judge them later. And I'm here to say content creators are not for that. I'm just a guy with a book collection who likes horror and disgusting classic literature. Whatever political opinions I may have in my mind are meant for me and me alone now. I'll watch current events and make my own opinion and keep it to myself. Not everybody has to have an open opinion about the state of the world right now, especially since the audience that I've accumulated ever since October of last year is not here for that. They're not here to watch me comment on the current president. They're just here because they want me to talk about Godzilla being a horror icon. The only times I've ever dipped my toes into politics whenever it comes to my current content is whenever those politics are inevitable, overlap, or supersede the ideas that I am talking about. I've only discussed the idea of the quote-unquote gay undertones about these classical books because I see it as an active misreading that diminishes the value that was originally intended with these stories. I've only argued the stance that not all art is inherently political because I genuinely think that diminishes the value whenever you only see art as political first. And the only reason why I brought up the racial allegory whenever it came to Sinners was because I couldn't see past it. And I saw it as an insult to diminish vampires to nothing more than a metaphor. Now, will I ever actually discuss politics invading my personal favorite genre ever again? Of course, inevitably. Some of my favorite books are tied to politics and I can't deny that. But my stance at the end of the day is always going to be, if the story can stand on its own without the political subtext, then leave the subtext out. Either that or leave it as subtle subtext. And if you still want to call me a coward and demand my political opinions, I used to be a political channel, so start digging. But for the rest of my audience who actually wants to see the content that I create, then stick around. I have plenty of requests to go through. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually not that big of a fan of modern Godzilla. Granted, these are really fun movies that are nothing more than popcorn flicks, but there's nothing more to them whenever you get down to it. Yeah, you can pull some bullshit commentary out of your ass about colonization, nuclear radiation, and global warming, but when the chips are down, we're just here to watch you flex the budget. And with the oversaturation of spectacle whenever it comes to monster films, we've kind of lost the idea that Godzilla was originally a horror icon. Yeah, the original movie wasn't about humans versus monsters, it was flat out everybody's gonna die unless we do something. With all the drama and character development being focused on people going through PTSD about the war. At the time of the film, Japan was still trying to socially recover from what happened at the end of the war. And America, being petty dicks at the time, was still dropping bombs in their oceanic backyard. So yeah, the Japanese people weren't really doing that well at the time. With everybody sharing the exact same trauma in the back of their heads, but not really being allowed to talk about it without it being taboo. But then the movie Godzilla came out with a monster that represented all that trauma, all that stress, all at once, and the film fully acknowledges it. Seriously, every character in this movie acknowledges that Godzilla reminds them of the bombing, with the main character being a scientist that reconciles with the fact that the only way to stop Godzilla is to create another weapon that's even worse. And he is so horrified over the fact that he has to do it that he makes sure that he cannot get out of this movie alive. This film is so horrifying whenever it comes to its plot and commentary that it borderlines on fucking depressing, which is why I have so much respect for Godzilla Minus One. It took us 70 years to get Godzilla back to being a horror icon. Meanwhile, other versions basically treat him like a superhero. I'm not really complaining about it because oversaturation happens and sometimes you gotta simplify in order to keep the market good. And the logic is fine because if you have one monster and you just say, hey, what if we put this monster in front of another monster and see what happens? Oh, people really liked it and actually rooted for the original monster based on familiarity alone? Oh, okay, then let's keep doing that until it becomes stupid. The character and idea survived, but the commentary was way lost and long gone, which again, I'm not gonna complain about because I have lizard brain, and I love watching a giant ape beat the shit out of a radioactive dragon. But at the same time, whenever we keep trying to recreate the commentary of Godzilla for the modern day, it keeps getting muddied, with one movie starting off with being pro-nature and just letting things run its course, and the other one basically having a pro-nuke message. And nowadays, with the modern movies, I have no idea where the commentary is. I do think that this is because you don't have Godzilla being a horror icon anymore. Because you can't have Godzilla be the hero of the movie while also representing global warming. And you can't also say that he's the planet fighting back and trying to heal from nuclear radiation, because every single movie keeps being pro-technology and a city getting destroyed. These movies really need to decide whether or not we're supposed to fear Godzilla or cheer him on. So yeah, I guess America, stop trying to turn Godzilla into an action hero while also having commentary, and Japan, just keep doing what you're doing. And my only criticism to both of you is that you're gonna make these movies include more Miku. Honestly, this is actually a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for so fucking long, and that is with the context that I am not a Pokemon fan. I don't play the games, I don't collect the cards, and I don't watch the show. But a long time ago, I was informed about the movies and how a lot of them took on different genre forms for each one. Some were sci-fi monster films, some were space adventures, and some were fantasy. So the idea of one of the movies having the focus be entirely on horror and some of it being existential was really up my alley, and I was really excited to see how Pokemon handled it. And after watching it, I have never wanted to rewrite a film so goddamn bad. This movie has so much potential that it is only barely tapping into whenever it comes to its horror, but every time they start to delve into it even a little bit, they pull back really heavily for some reason. And I think that clashes mainly because the horror that they're delving into is a really heavy one, but they can't help but be restricted by the fact that they're still a kid's show by the end of the day. The plot of this movie is that there's a town being trapped in a pocket dimension because two godlike beings that control space and time are fighting above it. And every time they clash, the pocket dimension gets smaller and the town collapses in on itself. And soon, if the fight keeps going, the town will just cease to exist. That is, unless they can get to the top of a bell tower and play a song that somebody else's grandmother learned in a dream whenever she was a child. Holy shit, this movie has so many cool ideas that are ripped right out of Lovecraft. And they just waste all of it. And I think that the majority of the problems of this movie is coming down to Darkrai and how they handled him, with him being the red herring of the movie that everybody is blaming for the disaster that's happening until they look up and see the gods fighting. And the way that this usually works is that the red herring is being used to trick the people in the movie and the audience. But the second that we meet Darkrai, the narrative immediately gives us another character explaining to us that Darkrai is not a bad person, which makes the entire mystery element of the movie until the gods are revealed a complete waste of time, especially whenever the twist is supposed to be that Darkrai is actually the hero of the movie that's been trying to help out in the background and nobody notices. But that doesn't work if the audience isn't allowed to make the same mistake and assumption that the characters are making. And then you have the whole element about the Pokemon gods fighting in the background and them causing all of this devastation, with the intended horror being the uselessness of trying to stop a fight between two godlike beings that exist on such a cosmic scale that just trying to get the attention of one of these things is like an ant trying to talk to a tornado or a storm. There's a lot of potential there, but the movie doesn't really take advantage of it. The fight choreography is really damn basic with nothing really interesting happening, and the human characters are way too far away from the fight for it to matter. This movie has so much wasted potential in it that I would die for a remake or a rewrite. There are so many untapped ideas whenever it comes to its horror and scale, including Darkrai as a character. But the human characters are basically useless, the horror is way too tame, and the plot never really delivers. So unless I get a remake in the near future or some kind of fanfic rewrite, I just feel robbed.